So, hello and welcome everybody to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. In this podcast today, we are going to talk about these insane asylums that were all over the world, actually, but mainly in America and UK and Europe as well, that happened in the sort of 1800 period. And there was a huge increase in the 1800 period. I'm going to go into the orphan trains and other subjects as well and talk about these subjects so we get an idea of how these insane asylums actually happen, because where did all these people come from? And I am joined with the amazing Stephen Denman. Thank you for coming again, Steve. Thank you, bro.
That's okay, Zach. Yeah, and how are you?
Very good. Thank you, my brother. And how are you doing? You good?
I feel fantastic.
That's
I feel
great.
great.
And
Yeah.
look, first and foremost, let's just give a little brief history to these insane asylums, because they did start popping up in the 1700s, and then but especially in the 1800s they just rocketed, and there was a massive increase in all these insane, mainly adults as well,
Yeah.
most of the time, and there were children, but it wasn't as many.
No.
Obviously you had the orphan trains as well, which we'll come on to.
Yeah, I mean that the whole really a lot of the development of the insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, both in the United States of America as with Canada, and obviously coming back across the Atlantic Ocean to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the various countries of Western Europe. A lot of it was connected to the orphan train movement. We see an exponential increase in construction of the insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals really around the same time. We know the orphan train movement, for example, in the United States of America occurred from around the 15th of January 1864 to the 20th of December 1889. And if you look at that period of time, there was an absolute incredible amount of construction work going on.
And for
The other
anybody
as
that doesn't know, just give a little explain to people what actually was the orphan train movement exactly.
So the orphan train movement was, it actually you can see in the phraseology what demographic it was concerned with was obviously parentless children or infants that had come from many countries, as we've discussed previously in Sacred Wisdom podcasts, uh, both from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, but also many countries in Western Europe, such as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Austria and Germany, and Spain and Portugal, and so forth, that were then transported across the North Atlantic Ocean to the eastern United States. There was massive overcrowding in the cities across the eastern United States because of this going on. And obviously, they were taken into the Midwest of the United States, many of which were adopted by various families. They were renamed, given new first names, surnames. So it's very difficult to trace any documented evidence to their actual genealogy and ancestry. So that's really what the orphan train movement was about, was the transportation of hundreds of thousands of children during that period of the 15th of January 1864 to the 20th of December 1889 across the landmass of the United States of America. And very large numbers of those children or infants had come from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, as well as Western Europe.
And we have
So,
to remember that was during the time of the Industrial Age, and you had
yeah,
1851, the Great Exhibition, and with loads of other world fairs happening at that same time.
absolutely.
So a lot of
Yeah.
repurposing was going on, what we would call probably almost like a previous reset that was
That's
happening.
right. It was a multifaceted approach by the policymakers or rulers. So you had obviously in terms of physical geography, the movements of vast populations of both adults and children. And as we've, just touched on in this Sacred Wisdom podcast, when it comes to the insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals in the United States of America and Canada and so forth, that was predominantly the adults that were placed into there to be reprogrammed and to have memory loss. So they and to really deculturalize them from the imprints that they'd carried from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, as well as in parts of Western Europe, to make them forget about the old world empire and to embrace the new order that was arising out of the industrial age and therefore the industrial revolution, this mechanization of human labor, And we see this with the Orphan Train movement. That's
Certainly.
also obviously connected to that with what was going on with in the farmlands and the agricultural expanses of the United States of America with these different parentless children or infants. So it was a quite horrific, quite traumatic what was taking place. But the other aspect to this we do need to really mention is that, yes, there were remnants of various Tartarian architecture based edifices within the United States of America and Canada that were built over or repurposed, but many of the insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals were actually built from the foundations up, were complete new builds, had nothing to do obviously with certain remnant buildings in the Tartarian architecture style that had been found in remote locations away from railroads, away from carriageways or roadways, in the landmass of the United States of America.
What I think so interesting about the insane asylums is the way that they're designed. They're designed in a very geometric design, almost like a sacred geometry. There was a certain pattern,
Yeah,
but these
yeah,
were built in a certain way that the energy of these, or the imprint of this trauma that was going on
yeah,
within these people within these asylums,
that's right.
that it
Yeah,
was just kept getting reprinted. And the
mm,
long corridors they had as well, where they
yeah,
would just walk up and down, almost creating these type of energy currents as well. I
mm,
find that amazing. But you were saying, obviously, there were some buildings already there from the old world empire,
that's right.
but you're saying some of these buildings were actually built from ground up. Still,
Of
that
course.
is still quite suspect, though. Sometimes some of them builds.
It is, but there are certain photographs that show the construction, the scaffolding, and construction crews building some of them. Some of them were constructed near railroads and at, industrial scale roadways or access routes, and many of them were not. So again, we were discussing this obviously in a previous Sacred Wisdom podcast regarding the star forts. So the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
situation, or the bastion forts as they're sometimes called. So some of them, yes, were the remnants of star forts or bastion forts that were constructed with Tartarian architecture. They were then mimicked or emulated at later stages in the historical narrative by the policymakers, by various European kings and European queens, etc. The same thing we see with the collapse of the old world empire in parts of the United States of America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Western Europe. Some of them were obviously constructed on those remnants.
Mm.
Much of the rocky or debris or the brickwork was reused. It may have been ground up and used as in the foundations as aggregates. But what we know is that a large number of these buildings were built from scratch. They were new builds as insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, and we can say yes, they possibly emulated some of the features of Tartarian architecture, which was seen as quite effective. And there's definitely the case to be made that many of these buildings that were constructed from the remnants, or literally they just literally inherited buildings that were in very good condition from the old world empire. They had long corridors, many of these buildings. They were Tartarian palaces or Tartarian stately homes. So as you know from, you look at, for example, Buckingham Palace, or you look at St. James's Palace or Balmoral here in
Yeah.
the United Kingdom of Great Britain, they have vast hallways and or corridors.
Mm.
And a lot of these palaces or stately homes were built on specific intersections of geomagnetic ley lines.
Leyland.
Yeah, so we know that the Nordic Tatarians, the Turkic peoples, were expert in doing this with their own construction processes, and Tatarian architecture was designed to utilize and optimize the geomagnetic ley line frequencies, vibrations, as with the drawing down of the telluric electricity from the ether or atmosphere.
Mm.
So yes, there may have been an inversion, a bastardization of these beautiful old world empire based or type of buildings that were then used as insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, and effectively making them insane asylums of Tartaria if these buildings were inherited and just simply repurposed in good condition from the old world empire for the process and the purpose of ultimately reprogramming the thoughts, the cognition, and the minds of the survivors from the Old World Empire, who are predominantly adults, the Nordic Tatarians and Turkic peoples who'd survived the cataclysms, the first mud flood, the second mud flood, the third mud flood, and whose children had been taken away on the Orphan Train movement to
Yeah.
be adopted with new first names and surnames by American people. It is horrific to think of, but
Mm.
a lot of the historical narrative does add up and make sense when you look at it from that perspective.
But you only have to look at the Lunacy Act of 1845, where
Yeah,
any male person within a household could send any female into one of these mental asylums.
that's
They
right.
they could literally call police up, and or police at the time, whatever they were called then. But
And you can see that the Lunacy Act, very interesting, that look at the gender that was being condemned and sent off to these
female.
insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals. So this was the denigration of the divine matriarchy, you see,
Yes. Yeah.
of the maternal instinct of those mothers that had come from Great Tartary or Great Tataria,
Mm.
regardless of whether they had settled in Western Europe at an earlier stage or come directly from Northern Russia and come along, on freight liners or cargo ships across the North Atlantic into the Eastern United States. And also, parts of Eastern Canada. We know there was some influx of these Tatarian peoples into Canada as well as the United States, but mainly within the United States of America. It is very, very serious because it
It is.
shows there were huge shifting of populations at this time during the industrial age or the industrial revolution. We
Mm.
see this with the various world fairs that were taking place,
Yeah.
especially in countries like France, as well as the United States of America, and obviously here in London, in the United Kingdom
A
of Great
huge
Britain.
amount.
And these were huge socio-economic and socio-cultural programming centers,
Mm.
preparing Homo sapiens or human beings of different nations, different countries for what was to come. This mechanization of thought and cognition, everything was focused on really Western materialism
Mm.
and the adulation eventually of this 3D holographic reality we call the material dimension, with the endless progressive rejection of the Christ consciousness and spiritual development and therefore personal development really being sidelined as irrelevance, then coming back as aspects of the New Age movement where there's been so much disinformation and
And it was
misinformation.
called the Age of Enlightenment. See,
But
ironic.
for who? The question is the
Yeah.
age of enlightenment, but for who? Was that for
Yeah.
the common people, the ordinary average Homo sapiens or human beings, or was that for those who were the inheritors of Tartaria, of the
Mm.
occult technology that they could keep for themselves,
Yeah.
really creating, in a sense, a new kind of dark age within the modern age?
But almost like a split in civilizations as also as well. This is what happened, and we had this huge divide, and bringing it round to now, this is where we're coming around to again. You can see this divide and what is created, and it's not a good place for anybody really.
But
Um,
you can see that the bifurcation of human consciousness, the vast traumas of the first mud flood, second mud flood, third mud flood, the collapse of Great Tartary or Great Tataria,
yeah.
this mass movement from northern Russia into Western Russia across to the Caucasus region.
Just before you go any further, Steve, just
Yeah,
give a little bit of a breakdown for that. So you had obviously northern Russia, you had the major mud floods that happened and other climate changes, things happening there as
volcanic
well,
eruptions,
volcanic eruptions, all
seaquakes,
this.
earthquakes. Yeah.
So this migrated, all these people moved into Europe and then they're kind of moved across and then moved from Europe into, or a lot of them were moved into the East Coast
Yeah, they
of,
become overcrowding was becoming a major problem in the cities of Western Europe. We see this in France, we see this in Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany. You have to remember that the birth rates, for example, in Germany were huge. So they already had an issue with overcrowding. So if you're just bringing in a mass influx of more individuals coming in from the Caucasus region, coming
right.
in from countries like Poland, coming in from Bulgaria, Romania, so therefore Eastern Europe, and consistently moving across the landmass of Western Europe, and they got into parts of France, then Spain and Portugal. Eventually, obviously, with the New World, which obviously the United States of America and Canada, the North American continent, it made sense that transportation across the North Atlantic Ocean would be the only solution, and take them into the eastern United States. And then from there, obviously, the orphan train movement, the great transportation and dispersal of these parentless children, and how awful that was, and how
Yeah.
traumatic for them it would have been. Um,
It's part of
but yeah,
history that's not never really spoken about, and it's not discussed in
no, it
the
isn't at all.
mainstream
No.
literature, what we're taught at school. And this was a major part to our history,
And
really.
yet, if you type in, a search for books on the orphan train movement, or just orphan
Yeah,
trains, there is a huge amount of books written by individuals from the United States of America and Canada, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and countries of Western Europe that go into a lot of detail, but
yeah,
it's still not taken seriously enough in a credible sense by Western science. And I think because it touches on many other aspects to do with the collapse of the civilization of Great Tartaria in northern Russia, the movement in that, therefore, initially into Western Russia and parts of Central Asia of these populations, then eventually the movement towards Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and obviously beyond to the North American continent. And I think another aspect to this, with the insane asylums of Tartaria or psychiatric hospitals of Tartaria, what we see very clearly is these were reprogramming centers, indoctrination centers. We have to remember that psychic abilities and telepathy was very common amongst many of the Nordic Tatarians and the Turkic peoples, because there was such a higher resonance amongst the citizens of Great Tataria and Northern Russia,
mm,
where using words, speaking sentences and phrases wasn't always the most prominent form of practical communication. It was more forthcoming in terms of the use of psychic ability and the use of telepathy. So we know, if you then have massive amounts of trauma, as with the
yeah,
collapse of Great Tartary or Great Tataria, and this mass movement, suddenly people are forced to move away from their own farmlands, their own townships, the white cities of Great Tataria. They are completely alienated. They feel completely disorientated, and the destruction that ensued with the destruction of the light temples, the divine temples in these white cities, the emergence of this giant movement of human beings trying to escape and get away from these upheavals, the first mud flood, second mud flood, third mud flood, etc.
yeah, of
This then dampened down their psychic abilities and their
course.
telepathic prowess. And if you then put them into insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals with the various methods that we used, that
Yeah.
further created a restriction on their own psychic abilities and telepathic abilities that the policymakers or rulers didn't really want them using, because they would be used as an access route and a psychical sense to remember the past, to remember the old world empire that they wanted them to forget about.
It's a very disturbing time, and you can see from the images that are going up, the it was very sad, and also the way it was documented as well,
Yes.
because these are people in traumatic states, and there was a
Yeah.
photographer there actually photographing this like event,
Yeah.
cataloging these memories of this trauma, a
Yeah.
very very dark period, and but yeah, the
Yeah.
disconnect from that generational trauma, we're back to that again, where
Yeah.
people disconnect from it, and disconnect from their children, their loved ones, or almost probably lost their children as well. They were taken away from them in some cases.
Well, you said there was so much warfare and conflict that had been going on in the Georgian period, the Victorian age. So when you see the magnificent looking public hospital of Williamsburg, that was also called the Eastern State Hospital or Eastern Lunatic Asylum, that was initially proposed to be constructed. Was initially proposed at the Virgin House of Burgesses by the British colonialist and lieutenant governor known as Francis Farquhar on the 14th of March, 1766. So
Right.
we can see from this that this was obviously something that people were very focused on actually developing a reprogramming procedure or a
Mm.
way to actually try and make individuals forget about the old world empire. We then see on the 12th of October 1773, the very first or initial patient was admitted to the public hospital of Williamsburg, also known as the Eastern State Hospital or the Eastern Lunatic Asylum, in the cityscape of Williamsburg in Eastern Virginia. So,
Right.
what we're seeing here is they were almost desperate to get this process up and running. This
Mm.
became an industrial scale. So again, here with the connotation with the industrial age, the industrial revolution, a mass change had to take place in the collective unconscious of Homo sapiens or human beings, and
Mm.
that old world order of Great Tartary or Great Tartaria had to be forgotten, had
Yeah.
to be, and part of that was the bifurcation and the compartmentalization of human consciousness through trauma and indoctrination and reprogramming.
And when you said the Williamsburg, the
Yeah,
Pennsylvania hospital was in 1751,
yeah,
and just saying that was 100 years prior to the Great Exhibition. So
yeah.
that tends to be the case these dates. You'll start seeing very similar dates, 100
There is
years, or you know,
correlations. Yeah.
yeah,
You look at the first mud flood, second mud flood, third mud flood, when they reached their most destructive phases, and around sort of 15, 20 years either side of that, the amount of events that were going on with the construction of the insane asylums or the psychiatric hospitals, as with, for example, the McLean Asylum that was founded on the 14th of April, 1811. Founded in the Charlestown district of Boston in Suffolk County in eastern Massachusetts. So again, you can see from this vast edifice that they were building. It was
mm,
also interesting to note that McLean Asylum was then renamed the Frankfurt Asylum for the Insane. So they were giving
right,
straight away that anyone that really was an individual, as we see with all the vast lists of excuses that females could be, basically placed into these insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, they were looking for any excuse to really ridicule and remove individuality
mm.
from American society at that time
It was
and
almost like a witch hunt,
Canadian
you know.
society. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, it was like get ripping out all this
yeah,
kind of a connection that people once had
yeah,
to reset it into this industrial age. And there are benefits to the industrial age that happen, of course there are, but there's also it's that period we have to question. And the more I look into it, the more concerning it becomes, because you see historically how strange this period was and how silenced as well so much of
yeah.
it was.
When it comes to, for example, the development of other insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, we had one building that was called the Asylum for the Relief of Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason. Question is, what had deprived them of their reason? Well, we've already gone into the destruction of the civilization of Great Tartary or Great Tatar would be a major or significant reason for somebody losing the cognitive ability to have reasoning because they're so traumatized.
Yeah.
It was then renamed the Frankfurt Asylum for the Insane. So they were labeling them up, you see. And then it was called the Friends Hospital. So you've got almost a passive aggressive phraseology being used. This building was constructed in Philadelphia in southeastern Pennsylvania, and it was the Friends Hospital was established by Protestant Christians known as the Quakers during the
Right.
22nd of February 1813. So here we have a Christian denomination getting involved in the reprogramming process of many individuals, many of whom were female, and many whom racially and genetically and ethically had come from Great Tartary or Great Tartaria.
Mm.
And many of these premises, not this occasion, many of them had been repurposed and were being used to reprogram the very individuals who'd come from the civilization that maybe centuries earlier had built in this style of Tatarian architecture, these beautifully ornate, vast buildings that perhaps were palaces or stately homes in their original usage. So there's a tremendous irony to what has gone on
Mm.
during the Georgian period, the Victorian age, concerning, what became eventually the Orphan Train movement and the development of these insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals. It was almost like a folding process where everything had to be forgotten. The ethnicities, the lineages, the genetic ancestry, the
Mm.
Tatarian architecture, everything had to be repurposed or deleted. It had to be distorted, had to be concealed away. And then we see the emergence in the industrial age, the industrial revolution, and the socioeconomic indoctrination at these world fairs is very integral to really much of what was going on with the insane asylums and what were also known as psychiatric hospitals, as with the incubator babies at many of these world
Yeah,
fairs,
yeah, yeah,
which is another level of trauma placed
yeah.
onto infants that couldn't defend themselves or have a say in how they were brought up. And all that did was create further alienation and the control of the American government coming in at that stage and taking control of families.
And the
So
foundling homes as well. I mean, that was
that's right.
immense. There was so much going on, and
Yeah.
all this reconditioning that we never hear about. I believe it. Even now we are in a sense we do have a sense of slavery in this modern day age.
Yeah.
100%, there is a sense of, but it was so intense back then. It's such a bizarre period,
Yeah.
and it gets stranger the more you look into it.
Well, you can see there was no employment rights.
No,
So you see during the industrial age or the industrial revolution, there's no personal protective equipment or PPE.
yeah,
Children weren't wearing shoes and socks. There wasn't health and safety signage or emergency lighting.
no.
These were extremely dangerous facilities, premises, or environments for children to work within. And yet, the orphan train movement was developed, and the policymakers, the rulers, were quite happy to see thousands and thousands of these children that had come from Great Tartaria, had come from Northern Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, being brought into the North American continent, being dispersed everywhere, and even their names were erased. They weren't even
And
they
not
didn't have a right to their birthright, their name, their ancestral surname was taken from them. And
mm,
that is very troubling and very sad and is
mm,
incredibly traumatic. And I would say that a vast number of those children, the orphan train movement, were very psychic and telepathic, and those
mhm,
abilities would have been quelled, suppressed, and damaged or restricted in some way through the consistent trauma and bifurcation of their own consciousness, their collective unconscious, really,
mm,
that was taking place. And it's very sad. But the adults were more difficult to deal with because they were adults. They already were fully culturally and spiritually imprinted with the memories and the customs and the traditions of Great Tartary or Great Tartaria. And so they had to be placed into these institutionalized premises, such as, the Kirkbride
yes,
psychiatric hospitals that we see, for example, Western State Hospital is one example in the cityscape of Western in Lewis County, Northwestern Virginia, that was opened on the 18th of January, 1864. So,
oh, 1864 ago. Oh, another.
there we have
How
it.
many buildings were built in that period?
Yeah, it's a key date, as we've discussed many times in previous Sacred Wisdom podcasts. And I mean, there's so many of these insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals, and these were all part of what was known as the Kirkbride Plan.
Mm,
And so there was a Pacific nationwide rollout across the United States of America under the Kirkbride plan to really have a vast nationwide network of these insane asylums of Tartaria or psychiatric hospitals as a mass indoctrination process of reframing consciousness, creating the suppression of certain thoughts to do with the past, to do with that civilization.
but
So
all
yeah,
over
very,
London
very
as
sad and traumatic what went on.
all over London as well. There were many mental asylums set up, and
Yeah,
you had huge and again very beautiful ornate buildings that were probably repurposed. They were used for
yeah,
completely different means before, but not forgetting Australia as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
Australia, there was, I mean, from London alone, I think close to like half a million to a million orphans or
yeah.
something
There was a
like that.
huge
That number,
deportation of British children that were taken to the Commonwealth
huge
of
amount.
Australia. Yeah,
Were they
and
British? We don't. Were they British? We don't know.
well, a
But
lot of them, I mean, British in the sense that they could have been English, Welsh, Scottish.
yeah,
Some of them may well have been children from Irish Catholics or Irish Protestants. And we know, for example, the psychological concept of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride really centered on what he referred to as moral treatment, inverted commas, of the mentally impaired. So
yeah.
they actually perceive that all these different, ailments that are listed for reasons why an individual could be classed as a lunatic or being classed as insane, especially with females, and the
Mm,
denigration of the divine matriarchy or the divine female as a archetypal concept was really, sort of brushed aside with these very neutral statements of moral treatment. Well, what is moral treatment? Is that did Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride believe that he had an ethical and moral duty to
mm,
indoctrinate and reprogram hundreds of thousands of citizens, many of whom were not American people that had only been in the United States of America perhaps for
months,
20 to
probably.
30 years, or maybe even months. But
Mm,
we will, again, we don't want to speculate too much. We don't know the exact dates on that. We do have much more accurate information when it comes to the orphan train movement. That is extensively listed, but there was a lot of secrecy and a lot of sneakiness about the practices that were going on in these insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals. And I
mm.
still think it's an absolute travesty and a tremendous irony that some of them were repurposed and were in good condition and originally were Tartarian palaces or Tartarian stately homes with these long corridors built on intersecting geomagnetic ley lines,
Yeah,
were then many, many generations later being used as indoctrination centers to make many of the Nordic Tatarians and the Turkic peoples forget all about Great Tartary or Great Tartaria and the old world empire that had been so eloquent, so epic, so spiritually focused on the Christ consciousness, free energy systems, the drawing down of telluric electricity or from the ether or the atmosphere over the white cities of Great Tartaria. They just
yeah.
couldn't. That had to all be forgotten. It had to be
And
deleted.
now them buildings are now either left to ruin, and
Yeah,
the ones in London, some of them places have been turned into flats now, which is interesting.
absolutely.
It's like the 21st century.
So you have a 21st century repurposing going on again. So,
Yes. Yeah.
and this is what you find with so many of these old buildings, from the Georgian period or the Victorian age. They're
Mm,
either completely demolished and high-rise luxury residential flats are built on there, or commercial office block, or they're gutted completely, compartmentalized, and they turn them into one or two bedroom apartments. And they're promoted and marketed as luxurious, high end for high net income earners. And so the past again is forgotten. It's sidelined. It's buried, and it's just cast aside. It's of no relevance anymore. And this has been going on for many thousands of years, actually. It goes back to the civilization even of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region and northern Russia. It goes back to the emergence of the Scythian Empire, and obviously then the emergence of Great Tartaria in northern Russia, as well as colonies around planet Earth.
mm.
It's a long-term process.
It's
This
being
has been going.
constantly going, reshaped all the
Yeah,
time. And
yeah,
people, right, that term right in front of your very eyes. People,
yeah,
it's happening all the time, people. So it's right here in front of us. You
yeah.
can
And
see it in London. I see it
you
all the
can.
time going on. The way these old buildings are just destroyed. And then people, what Oxford Street was, 30, 40 years ago, go back 100 years, it's completely different. And the
Yeah,
structures that were around
that's
there as
right.
well, and even in some of the what Green Park, talking about near Wellington Arch,
Yeah,
in the 1600s, 1700s, revolving palaces. Apparently this is
yeah.
recorded, this is historically recorded,
Absolutely. Yeah,
the
totally
what they
believe
had
it.
as
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's not any theory we're coming out with. This is stuff that it's amazing. I can't believe how much has been repurposed. Do you think they were successful in that repurposing and
Yes,
that kind of,
I
yes,
do.
that kind of
Yeah.
reset?
Yeah, because there was already so much trauma that was going on but long before the reprogramming and the indoctrination, there was so much trauma and disorientation. So people like Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride simply had to create a nationwide building and development program of these insane asylums or psychiatric hospitals. And then you just saw this mass indoctrination of hundreds of thousands of American people, as well as all the immigrants that were coming in, a lot of who were parents of these children that had ended up as part of the Orphan Train movement. So
Yeah,
you saw the separation
yeah,
of those parents from those children with the Orphan Train movement. That was another layer of traumatic bifurcation in human consciousness. And that when you do that, people shut away the fear, the terror, the panic, the anxiety. And
Mm,
this is really quite serious, that none of this is really being looked at from this perspective, and it is all connected.
mm.
But I guess if you say that many of the academics did start looking at it in Western science from this perspective and could see it all clearly, then we would have to have a complete overhauling of the historical narratives,
Mm.
because so much of what's being taught in schools, colleges, and universities is either a distortion or is completely incorrect.
Yeah. And there needs to be some sort of revision on this. And I think in time we will, because we'll start seeing the effects. We are seeing the effects of this historical narratives now. You can
Yeah.
see the outcomes, and we are having a huge rise in mental health. And this
So it's
problem,
epidemic levels now, the level of psychiatric sicknesses and mental impairment brought on by trauma.
yeah,
And it is especially in the Western world is at record breaking levels. It's known just here, obviously in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, we have the Samaritans, who are, they're unofficially classed as a branch of the emergency services, alongside the police, the paramedics from the ambulance service, and all the various fire and rescue services across the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And they really are supporting the National Health Service, or the NHS, with
of
their
course,
work.
yeah. And they're not funded by the government, are they? They're
No,
not.
they're
They're
a charity.
independently
They they
funded.
they do get some indirect funding, but it's not enough to cover their operational or administrative running costs. They do rely on donations from the public to keep going, and they're always understaffed. They're crying out for volunteers in the Samaritans. As with Mind, the mental health charity here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, it's such a serious problem.
Yeah.
The NHS is aware of it, but the HM government is very aware of it, and it's really an increasing acceptance that there is a serious emergence of very widespread mental health issues amongst not just the British people. You see it in Western Europe, you see it in Eastern Europe, you're seeing it everywhere.
And this comes down to this historical distortions that we have,
Yeah.
where people forget, they leave, they go into a traumatic state. And whether you're whoever watching, how what your views are on past lives, we do have a past life, we have future lives, so we're living these old traumas, and these are getting kicked back up when we get triggered in the reality we're in, or society we're in. These will reignite some of these traumas, and I think we're going through that again. And I think people are almost having, there's past life stuff coming up there as well, and
Well, that
it's very
does
dismissed, and
absolutely.
in our current system. But it does need to be addressed, these things. When you look at history and ancient history, you can see that actually past lives isn't too far out from what we are. It does make sense. There is a lot of evidence for that. But then in the modern day, we've kind of just put it across as some sort of woo-woo
Well,
healing energy. Oh, it's just
absolutely.
energy vibes, man. It's really important that we actually question this.
Well, if
You
you
know,
look at individuals like the clinical hypnotherapist Dolores Cannon, and also another very famous clinical hypnotherapist, Michael Newton,
yes,
those two individuals have so many client studies, and therefore case studies, of individuals who have come, male and female, that have come to them, and when they actually take them back into their past lives, what they find is the many of them describe this destruction and rebirth of the civilization they're part of. For example, we know that some individuals who have undergone hypnotherapy, they go back to a past life where they were, say, a temple priest in the civilization of Atlantis, but they're experiencing it in its last days before its inceptual destruction. And there's a mass evacuation of Atlantean citizens who are escaping on boats or sailing vessels to get away from the Atlantean continent and the Atlantean islands before there is complete destruction.
mm,
So there's a lot of trauma that goes back through many lifetimes. And
Mm.
really, in many ways, what happened with Great Tartary or Great Tartaria was a more contemporary version of what had gone on with the collapse and destruction of the civilization of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region and
Mm.
northern Russia, the destruction of the civilization on the Lemurian continent in that once existed in the Pacific Ocean, the
Yeah.
destruction of the civilization on the landmass that came to be known as the Atlantean continent and also the Atlantean islands. So this has gone on for a vast amount of time, over thousands and thousands of years.
Mm.
And I think it's also interesting bringing it back up to date in the modern age. If you read the book called The Architecture of Madness, Insane Asylums in the United States, that was written by Professor Carla Yanni. Now, in that book, she goes into a lot of details about the Kirkbride plan of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride and what he was trying to achieve. And to really summarize, yeah, he was trying to reprogram and indoctrinate hundreds of thousands of American citizens and many of the immigrants that had come in, the parents of those children that ended up in the Orphan Train movement, literally
Yeah.
separated from their parents in a process of forgetting the old world empire, the old world order. So
Mm.
he was trying to do it in a tasteful way because he recognized if you created very settled and relaxed environments for the reprogramming, it put the minds at ease of these individuals, so it was easier to reprogram them and to remove those old memories and imprints to do with to do with the past, to do with the civilization of Great Tartaria. So we know that Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride actually said a special apparatus for the care of lunacy whose grounds should be highly improved and tastefully ornamented. And he was really conveying that the premises he was building as part of the Kirkbride plan had to be sophisticated, relaxing, spacious, so that the actual indoctrination process could be successful, so that the actual patients felt relaxed in the settings they were placed into to
As they
make
were
it
being
easier.
programmed.
Yeah, absolutely. Now this quote was given
Like
on page.
television.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, this quote was given on page 56 of The Architecture of Madness, Insane Asylums in the United States, that was written by Professor Carliani, a really quite unique academic in her own right. And I think, is definitely a book that people should look at if they want to understand more about the Kirkbride plan and the overall psychological intentions of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride and the Kirkbride hospitals that he developed across the United States of America.
Amazing, Steve. Well, there is certainly, this is a massive subject again, like all these
It is
subjects. You can
indeed.
you can go into the member section, and there is a lot more on various other subjects as well, on Tartaria and other subjects we've gone into. But this is, I feel, is it needs to be addressed, this, by historians and people in academic positions, to actually question this story and actually revise it and look at it in a way that could be connected to our past lives and a much bigger spiritual journey that we're all on, that we kind
Yeah,
of misinterpret
absolutely.
about this reality because we're so condensed in this reality in a way to not believe these things
But
and
you
not
read,
see that.
all you've got to do is read many of the books of Delors Canon, or you can read Destiny of Souls and
There's
Journey of
lots
Souls
of
by
people
Michael
like,
Newton and
yeah,
many others.
yeah,
So many individuals who've written about their case studies from clients who've undergone, hypnotherapy, gone into their past lives, and you see a real pattern emerging of where they're part of a civilization or a societal grouping that's facing some kind of imminent destruction or upheaval.
yeah.
And this is going to lead, and then we see in the historical narratives that this then leads to the settling down and the reorganization and the eventual emergence of new civilizations. So this has gone on for a very long time, but unfortunately it's the psychological trauma that comes out of it and the restrictions it places on those individual homo sapiens or human beings that have very potent levels of psychic abilities and telepathy that then are quelled and are suppressed and sidelined because of all the trauma and the pain and the sadness and the disorientation that they go through.
Mm. And it's very difficult to get to that point when you're looking at security and safety, and
Yeah,
you're on that base need,
which is essential for all human beings.
Yeah, and when that's ripped out, and whatever happened exactly to make that migration happen all them years ago, it was deeply traumatic. And you can imagine,
Absolutely.
we do have mud floods go on today, and big events as well. But imagine, the earth below your feet started to move, and the
Yeah.
whole of the land started caving in. I mean, it
And
would be
everything
pretty.
that you knew is gone within hours.
Yes. And it's amazing, Steve, amazing podcast. And there is going to be more on this because this goes massive, in the sense of
It
we could
certainly
talk
does. Yeah.
again on this. But please, anybody, if you want any more information, please join the member sections. Lots more videos we've got in there and content, and we are adding to that all the time. You can also purchase our book, Luminous Worlds, which is now available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. And Stephen, thank you, my brother. That was brilliant as always, and insightful information as always, and help people remember. And that's what we want to do on this.
Absolutely.
So, yes. Thank you, Stephen. It's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.